I want to welcome you here and thank you for this honor. And I call this coming home. This is at sea level, out in the desert between Jerusalem and Jericho. And when you go to Israel, you feel like you're home. I've never had that experience before anywhere else. That when I go home to my little farm town in Iowa, in my younger years, I always had this longing in my heart as I'd get close to home. And the only other place I've felt it is right in Israel. Today I thought of something, so this is kind of last minute, but in the past I've done a presentation, and I'd like to read the prayer that I had at that time because I think that it has pertinence for today. Our Father in heaven, Lord, I've prayed these words to you so often, but recently I'm beginning to realize amazing implications of the fact that you are the all-powerful God who really wants to be a father. If you are the perfect God that I know you are, then there must be no surprise or unwanted pregnancies in your perfect program of Planned Parenthood. In fact, it seems that you've gone to unimaginable measures to create this universe for the very benefit of our incubation, to the end that we may emerge as sons of the living God. Just like the womb of flesh where we started, we were brought forth into a world where our hearing is still muffled and our view has short horizons. But unlike that womb, we are now contained in a place where we must learn to live and interact well with brothers and sisters in a nursery that has been very appropriately called a crucible of cause and effect. Even though you gave us house rules from the very beginning, I don't think you want robots or slaves in your home who just obey for fear of punishment. I think you gave us free will so that we could learn to choose to love you and fill your royal palace with willingly obedient children who have learned that our dad really is smart and that you make only rules for our protection and development. And I thank you, Father, in the name of Yeshua for these things. That reminds me also of a scripture in Jeremiah that segues into our experience here. Jeremiah is told by God that he placed Jerusalem, or is telling Jerusalem that God says, I placed you in the midst of the nations. The word midst there in Hebrew is a word that also means navel. So Israel and Jerusalem are essentially like the umbilical to heaven in symbolism. And so God feeds His Word and His Spirit and all the things that God gives us for nourishment through that umbilical, the stairway to heaven or the ladder to heaven that Jacob dreamed about. And from there it spreads in picture throughout the rest of the world to nourish us and give us the Word. So we'll begin with, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God, and all things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. So Jesus, the Son, God the Son, along with the Father and the Spirit, was from the very beginning. By Him were all things made that were made. Hebrews tells us, Thou, O Lord, in the beginning has laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the works of your hands. So Jesus, along with the Father, but Jesus was the architect before the foundation of the earth. He and the Father made the plans for the whole thing, ran the projections, saw the beginning to the end. They saw each and everything that we ever did before we were ever created. And that includes every rebellious and foolish act that we commit. But He loved us enough to make us anyway. And He created this world as a master builder. He built the geography of the land for His purposes, and He even rearranged the furniture in the flood. He was also, and is also, the finished carpenter. If you remember Him on the cross when He said, it is finished. Israel is a an amazing place. It's a tiny little land. It's only 290 miles long, maybe from here to Ames, Iowa. 85 miles wide. Imagine a place near here that's 85 miles from you. And that's the whole width of the country of Israel, but there are big bites taken out of it. The whole thing's about the size of New Jersey. If you superimpose it over the area of Kansas, you get this in the United States map. He also designed another feature. He designed the principle of returning to the place where he put his name, Israel and Jerusalem. In Leviticus chapter 23, we're told about and prescribed to honor the feasts of the Lord. There were 3 separate times of the year where the feasts were celebrated. In those separate 3 times, they were called the regalim, which was the time. Regal means the shin bone of the leg. It was a walking feast. So at that time, 3 times a year, the men of Israel were supposed to go to the place where God chose to put his name. The Ark of the Covenant would be there, and celebrate. Have a big family reunion with their Father, God. They would basically, the whole of the whole sacrifice system was a matter of preparing, cooking, and eating, either between us and our servants, the priests, or some was given to God as a whole gift to our Father, and it would be consumed in smoke and rise to him as his portion of the meal. Also at Passover was a feast of first fruits of the barley, but also the first fruits of the resurrection when Christ died on the cross. The second feast is a single feast that stands alone at the beginning of the summer. It's called Shavuot, or Pentecost as we know it. It's the time when the wheat is harvested, and it's the first fruits of the wheat that are celebrated. At that time of the year, the Sinai wedding covenant was given according to the rabbis of ancient times. In Exodus 20, verse 1 to 17, you have the account of God speaking the word of the 10 Commandments. They said that, the rabbis say that when God spoke the words of the 10 Commandments in their tradition, that the words traveled out of God's mouth, out from the mountain out across over the heads of the people as flames and tongues of fire. And they heard the 10 Commandments in the languages of the 70 nations of the mixed multitude that came with them, which is an exact picture of the upper room many years later after the resurrection. The disciples were in the upper room, had tongues of fire come out and rest on them, and then they went and spoke in the languages of the nations to give the gospel to the Jews that were there at that celebration. Every one of these celebrations would have hundreds of thousands of people that would show up in Jerusalem. So these things were not small little things. They were witnessed by multitudes. The last of the 3 feast regalim is called Sukkot, or the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles, and it's a feast of the great ingathering harvest in the fall. All these feasts have prophetic pictures. In Sukkot, in the three feasts that are celebrated during the Sukkot season, you have the Feast of Trumpets, you have the Feast of Atonement and Judgment. They say it's a day of judgment. You have a camping time, a time when you live in temporary dwellings. Now, temporary dwellings today represent us. We are in temporary dwellings at this point in our life until we die and resurrect and get our permanent bodies. So, as part of the principle of return, our SouthWoods group followed that principle and took our turn to return in 2011 and 2018. This was our gang last fall in October on the Mount of Olives overlooking the Temple Mount with the gold dome behind us. 2,000 years ago in Acts 9:32 to 9:35, Peter healed a man named Aeneas in Lydda. The man was a paralytic, it says, which meant he couldn't move his legs, and it kept getting worse as time went by. The man was in that condition for 8 years. So in that same place, we touched down today at Ben Gurion Airport, in the same place where Aeneas was raised up. Before Israel became a nation, Ben Gurion Airport was Lydda Airport, named by the English folks that had control of the area at that time. From Lydda, we would travel 9 miles to the next location where we saw a population. In Acts 9:36 to 10:32, we see Peter goes to Joppa. Joppa is named after Noah's son Yofi. Joppa is a port city. It's one of the oldest cities in the world. In that city, Peter was called by a couple of disciples that came from Joppa to come and comfort the disciples in Joppa because a woman named Tabitha had died. He went to Joppa and raised the woman from the dead. Then he stayed and roomed with a man named Simon the tanner near the Mediterranean Sea, which is a good place for tanners to work because of the stink from the hides and those kind of things. They could wash them and do all that. One day on the roof of Simon's house while he was waiting for lunch, he fell into a trance, had a vision of a sheet of unclean beasts that were descended down 3 times, and he was told to rise and eat. Peter said he never had eaten unclean things, but God said, what I call clean, don't you call unclean. So at that very moment, men from Caesarea showed up, representing their employer, and told him that Cornelius had a dream, and that he was to send for Peter, a man named Simon Peter, who was at Simon the tanner's house, and bring him north to Caesarea. 2,000 years later, our bus follows Peter's path to Joppa and then on up toward Caesarea. We're in the land of milk and honey from the time of Bible times. But more recent years, when I was a kid, Israel was basically thought it was just a big barren desert. Not long after Tabitha was raised from the dead, the rebellion of the Jews to the obedience to the Torah and the rejection of Messiah brought death to the land. And for 2,000 years, the whole of Israel died a slow and continuing death. And it was in an answer to God's promise when he told them if they would keep his commandments and follow his ways, they would be blessed above all the peoples of the earth. But if they don't, he said he'd bring the land to desolation. Your enemies will dwell therein, shall be astonished at it, and I'll scatter you among the heathens. And I will draw out a sword over you, and your land shall be desolate, and your cities waste. In 1867, Mark Twain visited Palestine. He wrote about it in a book called Innocents Abroad. He said it was a desolate country and rich enough dirt, but it was given over wholly to weeds, and it was a mournful expanse where they never saw a human being in the route. There was hardly a tree or shrub anywhere. Even the olive and cactus were the fast friends of worthless soil were almost deserted in the country in answer to God's promise that he was going to make that land desolate. Part of the reasons for that was when the Romans and different enemies would conquer Israel and destroy them as they were being driven out of the land, they threw a lot of the rubble and debris from the cities into the rivers. The rivers backed up and became swampland. In the early 1900s, late 1800s, the swamps over there produced vast amounts of mosquitoes, and malaria was an enormous problem. As the Jews moved back into the land, they had to somehow dry up the swamps and fight that malaria. In 1400s, I think, 12 or 1400, Suleiman the Magnificent, the Caliph of Turkey and the whole of the Arab world, put a tax on trees. So everybody in Israel, and throughout his kingdom probably, to stick it to the man, they just cut down their trees. Once the trees are cut down, you have nothing but desert. So that's the reason this land was such a desert when Twain went through the land. But there's been restoration. We live in an amazing time in our lives, one of the most amazing times in history. We get to see the restoration of Israel, God's land. We get to see a restoration of the people to God's land. In the last 100 years or so, the Jews have come back into the land in multitudes and have restored the land, planted crops, trees by the millions. In 1909, there was a small handful of Jews, I think that was either 60 people or 60 families that lived in Joppa. And Joppa, next to it was a sand dune. They wanted to get away from the community of the Arabs and start their own little private, or their own little community. So they moved out in the sand in 1909. And today, where they moved to, their little community turned into the 25th ranked financial global city in the world. It's among the top 10 cities in the world in tech, in Tel Aviv. As we look to the bottom of the picture, you see the red roofs. That's the area of historic Joppa. The little hook there out into the sea is a harbor, and then Tel Aviv is off to the north. So we traveled through Tel Aviv, somewhere in this area, and there was red roofs. Peter lived with Simon the tanner. The land is being restored. God is bringing back the crops and the land in Israel beyond imagination. This is the Jezreel Valley. The coastal plain, the Sharon Plain between Caesarea and Tel Aviv are like this. This big plain in the Jezreel Valley, which is near Megiddo, is that way. It's like flying over Kansas. It's just a vast, abundant crops of every sort. They grow flowers there. 40% of all the floral shops in Europe are supplied by flowers from Israel, they told us. Orchard, wheat fields, on and on. It's amazing the abundance in the land, and we'll see more of that. The history is being restored. In 1948, the same year that Israel became a nation, they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, the first of them. This is an overhead shot of Magdala, the hometown of Mary Magdalene, that was a couple feet under the dirt 20 years ago. The language is being restored. In the late 1800s, a man named Eliezer ben Yehuda decided with his wife, that they were a young couple, they decided that they were going to raise their kids hearing nothing but Hebrew for their whole growing up time, so that their native tongue would be Hebrew. Now, Hebrew was a dead language. It was kind of like Latin is in the Catholic Church. So you have, this man had a one-man campaign to raise his kids as Hebrew-speaking children, and he spent his life gathering words from around the world from different periodicals and writings to find more and more Hebrew words to add to a dictionary that became the language of Israel. They originally was talking about, at the time that Israel became a country, they were talking about having German as the native tongue, but it didn't happen. God had better plans. Here's a picture of a little shop in Jerusalem. It gives you an idea of Hebrew, and the guy using the English words to boot. His name is Yossi Mediyahu, and Joey Matthews is what we would call him. Okay, as we look across up the Mediterranean Sea and toward Tel Aviv, we're standing near the port of Joppa. This is an idea of the port they have there today, and I don't know, I'm sure the big ships are anchored out in the sea somewhere, and they take little boats and ferry in, so most of these are smaller vessels. But probably still in the same area that ancient Joppa's port was. In that area was the same place that Solomon floated big rafts of cedar logs from Lebanon down. From here, they floated into Joppa, loaded them on carts or however they got them up to Jerusalem, 40 miles across land, and built Solomon's temple and his palaces in Jerusalem. It's the same place Jonah got on a boat and ran the opposite direction when God told him to go to tell Nineveh that they were going to be destroyed in 40 days if they didn't turn from their ways. And it's the place where Peter had his vision. Joppa's on a main highway, an ancient thoroughfare. It's called the Via Maris. Via meaning way, Maris meaning sea, like maritime. So it's the way by the sea. And it was the main artery of transport along the seacoast up the Sharon Plain, the coastal plain there along the Mediterranean. And anything that was shipped by land from Egypt up to Europe, Far East, or let's see, this is the Fertile Crescent here. Down in here is the Fertile Crescent, and then on to the Far East, the spice routes and the trade routes to India and China. Anything that come through this area was on this major thoroughfare, or the little red one right to the right of it, which is called the King's Highway on the other side of the Jordan River. While I'm thinking about it, I'd like to hand this map around to give you an idea of the Rift Valley, the Sea of Galilee, the Dead Sea, Jerusalem, the coastal plains that I'm talking about right now. This is the Jezreel Valley. It was a natural travel way up and toward the trade routes to the east. So if you'll just pass that around, I'd appreciate it. Give you an idea of the topography. Now, the Dead Sea is almost 2/3 of a mile lower than the peak at Jerusalem, to give you an idea there. When the first time I got to Israel, I expected a whole lot of this. And I was amazingly surprised. Instead, we saw more things like this than you'd ever expect. Office, a little shopping mall here north of Tel Aviv, got an office supply, a Castro's clothing store, I think it is, Super Farm, Toys R Us, and McDonald's. You can see why they call Israel Little America. As we're traveling farther up the highway, if you look off to your left, you'll see the Mediterranean off to the left. And if you look to the right in certain places, you see the wall. Now this is the defense structure that Israel put up in the populated areas and places where there might be sniper attacks and things like that. It would be a huge, tall concrete wall with razor wire at the top or sloping concrete slabs to protect from rifle shots from high places and that kind of thing. But out in here, it's just a fence. And when you look at this area, somewhere in here, it's 9 miles between the sea and that fence. And if you look down this little slightly darker shaded area, that is the West Bank, and then I think they call that Judea to the south of Jerusalem. But you can see why the Israelis say that the 67 borders are indefensible. There's only 9 miles of distance between them and the sea. And another amazing little turn of phrases is to call this, which is the West Bank of the Jordan River, clear over 2/3 of the width of Israel there. That was an armistice line. That was a ceasefire line originally. I think it was in '67 when they called a ceasefire, that was where everybody stopped and where they were facing each other in the bunkers. Inside of Jerusalem, you'll see zigzags through streets and random broken looking border lines. But now they're trying to force that into being the border line for Israel and a new Palestinian state. As I said, as you travel up the Sharon Valley, you're seeing tremendous amounts of crops, vineyards, wheat fields, flowers, fish farms. They have ponds all over the place with fish farms. Greenhouses, just acres and acres of greenhouses that are growing whatever crops they grow inside the greenhouses. Vineyards and olive groves, row crops, livestock, bananas, citrus groves. It's amazing how much truly this land is coming back to become the land of milk and honey. As we travel up a little farther, we come across, go up the Mediterranean. We come past a city named Netanya, where we stayed in 2013, a resort city there. It's beautiful along the Mediterranean Sea. This was out our window of our motel room. And last fall, we came to the traditional Israeli way station, Ramada Inn at Hadera. We stayed the night there and kind of try to get over jet lag and go off to our first day of travel. So we travel on up the coast. As we're going along, we see this power plant out at the edge of the sea. And they tell us to remember this place. It supplies a huge amount of power for the country of Israel, but it also has a landmark significance later. So we travel on about 39 miles from Caesarea up to, from Tel Aviv up to Caesarea, and that's the walking distance that Peter would have gone with Cornelius' servants. When you get there, this is an overview from I downloaded a number of things from the web because I lost a lot of my photographs I lost my camera last trip, and also some of these things are just better to display the answer. But any of these things that you see, they're excellent websites, so if you see one, I've tried to make sure that the credit's given to every one of them. In Caesarea, it was a place that was built by Herod the Great about 10 years before Jesus was born. And he built a Roman city and called it Caesarea Maritima, Maritima by the sea. Caesarea, named after his god and king, Caesar. All the Caesars were considered man gods. That was one of the big problems they had with the Jews, because the Jews would not worship a man. In this area, there's an amphitheater up at the top. He had his palace built here. Right along here is a thing called the hippodrome. Hippo means horse in Roman, so whatever Greek or whatever language it is. So it's a racetrack. It's a Ben-Hur racetrack. Then you come here to the harbor. This is all made out of concrete. The Romans were amazing with building concrete. They shipped over, I read somewhere, over 200 shiploads of volcanic ash to mix with their cement that they built caissons, and this is all poured cement to build this protective harbor. Right there in that green grass used to be water. And so this gives you kind of an overview of what we're going to be looking at. So we get to Caesarea, they call it Caesarea, and the first thing we see is a bunch of statues that they picked up out of the ocean. And the statues are all headless and armless and all that. I always thought that was, kind of like the statue of David was just some kind of accident or whatever, time got to him. But actually what happened when people would conquer lands, these were the gods of the local inhabitants. And they would always go in, just like we saw Saddam Hussein's statue being destroyed and beheaded in Iraq years ago. People would go in and knock the heads and arms off the statues. So that's the reason for that. This is an artist rendering of what the amphitheater looked like. They had a big backdrop that's no longer there, and even canopies that they could retract and draw out like an open shade over their theaters. Our guide told us in 2013 about this, so I looked it up. These shows were usually free to the public. Emperors believed it was a good way to keep the people of ancient Rome happy and content while they governed. So they provided free bread and free entertainment to keep the peons happy. so they could govern the way they wanted to. It kind of reminds me of the welfare system here. Free phones, they didn't have cell phones. Pardon me. So the top here, that opening is a port they called the vomitorium. So vomit means to empty out quickly. So in these days, I've heard different people say that that was where the drinkers in the theater would go and vomit, but that's not what it was. It was just a way to empty out the stadiums quick, just like we have Chiefs and Royal stadiums. And they still use it today for concerts and that kind of thing. If you look right about there, that's a lighthouse. In the ancient times, one of the 7 wonders of the world was a lighthouse in Alexandria, Egypt. This thing is similar to that. Is much taller in the day that it was used, and they would light fires and use mirrors to reflect the light out into the sea. So this is the place where Peter comes with the Gentiles. The first Gentiles become believers in Cornelius' house. Paul is held in prison for the first time he comes there that we're told about in the Bible was when he was rejected by the Christian people in Antioch and then Jerusalem, and so he went back to Tarsus, his home area, and he left from Caesarea off the Mediterranean to the northwest. The next time he was held prisoner for 2 years when they sent over, I think it was 470 soldiers to escort him out of Jerusalem and protect him to bring him down here when he pleaded his case to Rome in Acts, I think. I can't remember exactly where that was. So this is just another shot of it. Some of the beautiful cornice work on the top of the buildings. This is a bone box called a sepulcher. When you read about people being buried in somebody being buried with their fathers, a lot of times they would bury the corpse in a cave or in a dug grave of some sort. And then after a period of time, after about a year, they'd take the bones out and put them in a box and reuse the slab for the next corpse. There might be a number of family members, your grandpa and your ancestors and all that, buried in the same box. So this is a pretty rich man's bone box there. It's a pretty fancy one. Another thing they had was in the 80s, the naysayers of the Bible said that, there was some record of Pontius Pilate being a Roman, but there was nothing about him being a prefect, they called it, a governor of Judea. Said that proved the Bible was wrong. In the 80s, they found that, and it says Pontius Pilate, prefect, right on it, even in English we can read it. It was found in 1961, I guess. This is an artist rendering of Herod's palace there. You'll see the hippodrome above it. That's the racetrack up there, his palace here, and back over down in here would have been the amphitheater. As we go out onto the ruins of that palace, where Paul was probably tried or, probably had association with at different times, you come out into the outer edge of it. This is a freshwater swimming pool that Herod had put in his palace so they could have swimming in fresh water or salt, I guess. That's some of the Roman linoleum. It's mosaic tile that's 2,000 years old in that area, more of it. Then we head off toward the hippodrome. The hippodrome was a racetrack, as I mentioned, and everywhere we look, we see little pieces of red clay tile, clay pots, just like a geranium pot, little pieces of red pottery. And they're scattered everywhere. It was used for all kinds of things in that time. and they would write notes on it. You might make your grocery list or, write a note to mom that you're going to be back in a little bit. But anyway, so they were repurposed, and they're found everywhere. First time I noticed that was on that racetrack. So this is the artist rendering of the racetrack. The wealthy would get to sit on the turns where the coolest wrecks would happen. And they had little wrought iron statues, several locations in Israel to depict their function. You go over into the green grass of that area and you see a stone anchor that's laying in the area that used to be water. And the docks would have been here, and then on behind it we'll see grottos, or these areas up here were places to stand your favorite pagan statue. And so now I'm going to show you a more close-up of this harbor. Let's see. So you look off to one side, and you can still see the water breaking over what's left of the concrete there, and to the south coming around that way. It's amazing to me that you could have 2,000-year-old concrete that was still standing and holding together when we throw salt on the sidewalks around here, and next year we've got to replace the sidewalks. As we leave that area, we come to the city gate heading out of town. Main feature of the gate is that it doesn't go straight through it. It turns, and that's for defense purposes. The city gates in biblical times were places like the courthouse square. You had, you would have court cases, appeals to the city fathers and those kind of things, probably the city clerk and all those kind of things. And the old geezer sitting around the courthouse square, spitting and talking over the day's weather. When you leave outside of that, you come to the first example of a dry moat that we saw. Now, a dry moat is like in the King Arthur's castles where they were full of water. They would dig a moat like this when there was an area of high ground that came in, and they wanted to create a higher wall for defense. So they dig these moats, and you'll see one in Jerusalem that's very significant. And in times of defense, they put spears and things like that sticking up so people would fall into the trench and fall on a spear or whatever. Okay, this is the main water main for Caesarea. These arches that I've thought for years was just what was left over of Roman ruins of buildings were actually a support system for water troughs. And you look at the end of it and you see the water ditch that carries clear out of the mountains. In one place I read that one of these things was erected, was 67 miles long and had a 7-inch drop. So their technology was such that they could be that precise. So the water would be piped in off of reservoirs in the mountains and then somehow piped down to supply troughs or whatever to supply drinking water or whatever they use, bath water, Harrod swimming pool, all that kind of thing. And then underneath they would have troughs cut and surrounded by a slab rocks on the top and a trench that would have constant running water for flushing the sewage. So it was a pretty modern setup and Christ lived among probably 15 or 20 of these metropolises within 30 or 40 miles of his home. This is a picture of that same aqueduct heading out of town as we're on our bus leaving and looking out across. I think that's a bean field, but it's amazingly lush field, off into the mountains of Carmel. And somewhere up in there was their reservoir and water supply. So then we come to the Carmel Mountains. And at Carmel, we ascend, and this is one of the few places at the time of Mark Twain that there were actually some olive trees still growing. And today it's a pretty lush forest. And you get to the top where Elijah had the contention with the prophets of Baal. And fire came down and consumed Elijah's sacrifice, and the other guys cut themselves and cried and spent most of the day trying to convince their God to do it, and they never got anything. Elijah said, well, maybe he's taking a nap or, had to go to the bathroom or something. So He mocked him, and then finally he asked God to bring down fire. God consumed the sacrifice, the wood, the water, everything about it. And it says Elijah rebuilt the altar. So evidently there had been an altar there sometime before. It's said that any time an altar is built to the Lord, it is always an altar. So that's significant. So there's only one thing that we see next to that statue that is not the only thing, but we see next to that statue a Catholic church. And it has a set of steps to go up to the top of the mountain on that church. And you get a beautiful view of that whole area. And so I'm going to show you some pictures now following that arrow around, be several shots from the top of that monastery or whatever it is. First of all, looking clear back to the left, you see the Mediterranean Sea and the lush lands of the beginning of the Jezreel Valley, the Armageddon Valley. It's called Armageddon. Har means mountain. Megiddo is the name of the town there, so it's a mountain of Megiddo, and this is the valley that it overlooks. As you come on around a little bit, you see Nazareth off in the distance, and then about, I'd say, northeast, you're looking toward Galilee. An interesting feature here in the Jezreel Valley are this V-shaped structure. What that is two jet airplane runways. Excuse me. In 67, Israel defeated the Arab armies that were going to attack and try and run them into the sea by hitting Egypt's Air Force while they were on the ground. And they wiped out their whole Air Force and therefore won the war in 6 days. I think that they probably had that in mind either before or after that fact and built their defense in the ground. That's an underground Air Force base. So when the need arises, they pop airplanes up out of the ground and shoot them off down those runways. Then on around a little bit more, you see the Galilee, and then a city called Bet Shean, where Saul and his son their corpses were hung on a wall when they were defeated by the Philistines. On around from Bet Shean, almost looking southeast, is an area that would be the Dead Sea, if you can see over the top of the mountains. And not far from it would be Jerusalem. And again, all these trees were probably not there in 1900, or at least the 1850s. So they planted millions of trees, and Israel today is the only shrinking desert in the world because of the plants and the things that they're growing. And then we come around to the Mediterranean, and remember the power plant, that's about where that was. So that gives you kind of an overview of how close things are, really. One thing I wanted to show you, when Elijah conquered, when the prophets of Baal failed and they took them to a place that said was the brook Kishon, or the Kishon River, and slew all the prophets of Baal there. Okay, well, they were up on this mountain where we're standing looking down. That Kishon River is right there, so they took them all the way down there. So don't think Elijah took them by himself. He must have had the whole crowd convinced that Yahweh was God, and they then turned against the prophets of Baal and followed Elijah's leadership. Don't know for sure. It doesn't exactly say that, so I'm not sure if that's the case. But I think it is. Then as we leave Mount Carmel, we come to the spot where we see the first grave with a rolling stone. And this is just one that they found as they were making this highway north. Interesting thing about this is the corpses would usually be laid in here for about a year, and then the bones would be brought out and stored in different receptacles with other members of your family or whatever. So this wasn't one of the fancier ones, but it's the first example of that. Then we go to Megiddo. Tel Megiddo, as we look at it from the Jezreel Valley, it's a mountain or a hill that's actually 22 civilizations tall. When you hear of a tel, that means hill, and it's typically a hill of ruins of cities that are piled up on each other. So we come to Tel Megiddo, a place that is a lookout post and a military post to overlook all the traffic that comes up and down the Jezreel Valley. And there's a lot of it, because anything shipping into that area would offload onto caravans and come across toward Bet Shean or Capernaum, we'll see in a minute, or they would come from north and south and still cross that same area. So Solomon had his defenses there. He had his tank corps city there. In those days, a chariot was something like a tank. Solomon, it says in 1 Kings, had 40,000 stalls of horses in his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. He didn't have 40,000 chariots. He had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots. He probably had 3 horsemen for a chariot, a groom and a couple of drivers, or a driver and a shooter, or however that went. And then relays of horses to change out to continue in the battle. And that is often contended by naysayers of the Bible. In another spot it says Solomon had a different number of chariots, and they always say that's a mistake in the Bible. They're totally wrong. So in the museum going into that area, this is a model we saw of Jericho. You can see here the main gate going into, or not Jericho, of Megiddo, and Solomon's entry there to his city. One of the more ancient civilizations under it they dug up, and there's probably 4,000, I don't know how old, but much older than Solomon, stairway to a Canaanite city that was there, and they've dug down too. This is a picture of the gates going in, what they look like today, and that's what the artist rendering of it would be. And here is the Burks and Keith and Ulita and Carol and several of the people from the first trip entering the gates of Megiddo. When you get up there, you see all kinds of archaeology. They've done an awful lot of digging around there. One of the things that you see that's significant, catches your eye, is this altar here. That's a Canaanite altar. They found bones and different artifacts that proved that it was a sacrificial altar. And this is a model of it in the museum there. When you get out and look from Megiddo, that gives you an idea of what kind of view the soldiers had as they watched over the travelways and the fields in that area. When the Egyptian armies would come through and attack the Hittites, and the Hittites would come back to get the Egyptians, and the Assyrians would come through there. Napoleon fought a battle in that place. So it is the place where they talk about Armageddon, the Battle of Armageddon. It may be that there's a battle there again, but it also may be that that's just where the troops are mustered for a battle that goes on down where they would travel then toward Jerusalem in the valley of Jehoshaphat that's talked about in the Bible. Another picture of the lush crops around there. This was the wheat harvest when we were there at Shavuot. We dined among Jewish folks that were celebrating Pentecost and eating in the motel or hotel where we stayed. On across the way is Nazareth. In Jericho, they had a pit silo there. It was just enormous. These steps are going all the way down to the bottom. You can't even see the bottom there, and that's a normal step, so you can get an idea how deep it is and how big. It says there were 450 cubic meters of grain held in that thing. So you take your basket, walk down the steps, scoop up grain for your horses, and go back and feed them in the mangers. And this is the feeding troughs that they used. In the stables, they would have stone-hewn manger troughs. Every city or village has one thing they have to be a city or a village, and that's water. So anytime you have a travel way with a water supply next to it, that's the reason that a lot of these places were built over and over in the same place. The reason 22 different civilizations were built in Megiddo is because there was a huge spring there and it supplied water for them, plus all the additional benefits of a place to grow crops and defense and all that. It's 183 steps down this thing to get to the spring today from where Solomon's city would have been. This gives you an idea how deep it is. Then we cross the valley. We go across the Megiddo Valley to Jezreel Valley. Jezreel means springing up, by the way. So it was cropland for a long time. You can look across the way and there's Nazareth. We come in and we see a sign that says Nazareth Elite. We would call that Nazareth Heights, just like Brooklyn Heights or whatever. And that's the main section of town in Nazareth that has Jewish population. Nazareth is mostly an Arab town, and it used to have a fairly significant population of Christian Arabs and Christian natives, whatever. They're percentage-wise shrinking all the time because the Muslims are having great big families and kind of overruling through attrition or population. Over inside of the city of Nazareth, which is a pretty good sized city today, they found this place outside a little field behind a hospital property. And this is what it looks like, and this is what it was. It was a natural wine press. They determined it was from the time of Christ, and they think that since Nazareth was a small city or a small town, that may have been the community wine press. So it may have been Christ as a child could have even stomped grapes in that place. A bunch of Christians got together, organizations and people, and donated and bought the acreage there and made what we would be similar to like the Mahaffey Farm or Missouri City today, reconstruction of first century Nazareth. In that area, you see they've got a picture of what a typical home may have looked like, and the different rooms that are built on around a central open area. And when you see where in the parable where the husband, the groom goes to build a room on the father's house, this might be that type of thing. Notice that in all the ruins you see just old rough rocks and knee-high stuff, and everything else is knocked off and gone. And that comes from kind of two different reasons. First of all, people salvaging rock, stone, cut stone, all that kind of thing, as well as lumber, was valuable stuff. So when a city was raised, the next population came in, would grab all the good stuff and take it back to build their properties. And anything below about knee high was the lower parts of the walls and floors of these areas, because the enemy had come in and push over the walls and knock everything in. So the rubble would pile up a couple feet high, and then they'd level dirt off and start building again. So you always see these archaeology things where you'll see knee-high walls and floors, and that's it, and that's the reason why. But back to my rough stone thing. When you see the rough stone, you're looking at the stud walls of the building. The sheetrock and the wallpaper is applied plaster outside. So that gives you a little bit more understanding of what you see when you get to a archaeology dig. One of the significant things we saw at Nazareth Village was this plant, and it's called za'atar, herb in Arabic, I think it is. But that plant, when we were there, it didn't have the purple flowers on it, but it's hyssop. Hyssop is what the Jews used to strike the lintel and doorpost in the Passover, to put the blood on the doorpost. It's a healing property. It has healing properties. So it was a symbol of the healing of the blood in a way. And also hyssop was used by the Roman centurion or soldier that offered Christ vinegar in a sponge, and said he put it on hyssop and offered the sponge to vinegar to Christ when he was on the cross. So that would indicate that the cross wasn't very tall. The people weren't that far off the ground when they were crucified, if my assumption's correct, and they didn't put the sponge on hyssop on a spear or some extension pole or whatever. But I always wanted to find out what hyssop was like, and that's it. And that's a picture of a cross there in their little museum as you enter the place, and it is a short cross. So, and when it says Christ was hung on a tree, it gives you an idea of what maybe it wasn't a square railroad tie cross, you know. As you look down into the little farmland of Nazareth Village, there's this thing right there. That's a threshing sled. They'd cut the shocks of grain and scatter them out on a floor that usually was in a windy area, and hook a donkey or a ox or something and drag that sled around on the ground, and that would knock the grain off of the straw. And so when the straw was separated from the grain, they'd take pitchforks, throw it in the air, and the wind would blow the chaff and the straw away, and the grain would fall to the ground. And so some of these images in the Bible of threshing and all that, you get a understanding better of this kind of thing. That sled's made with holes drilled in the underside and little pebbles driven in it, so it had little rough spots to knock the grain loose. And when you hear about building a vineyard and putting a tower in it in the New Testament, this is what it's talked about. It's a lookout tower or a guard tower protect your crops. This thing is like the booths, like the Feast of Booths in the fall, temporary little dwellings. We used to build those things for our calves on the farm, give them shade in the summer. And this is some of the shops and things in Nazareth Village. A shepherd with his sheep and woodworking shop, and a guy making a plow down in the corner, and a lady spinning yarn, making cloth. Give you an idea. It's a very interesting place for a new reenactment type of thing. And they even dug a grave into solid bedrock there. They said it took about 2 months with a hammer and chisel. I don't know how many guys had hammers and chisels to do it, but 3 or 4 people could get inside that. You had to duck to get in, but it was several people at a time could go in there. And there's Betty crushing olives. The olives were thrown whole in that center trough, and they would hook a animal to it, or a person would push it around in circles and mash the whole thing into a mush, put it in these baskets like this, and then take it over and put it in a press. And this is the type of press they used. The basket would be placed under here, and the weight of the press would press down on it. I think the first pressing was even just the oil that dripped out of it, and that would have been the oil that was used for anointing and faith purposes and that kind of thing. And then each time they would add a little more weight, they'd raise a stone up and put a rod through the loop in the bottom of that rope, and then let that weight down, and it'd press a little bit more, and it'd be the second pressing, a third, and all that. When the last pressing would be the stuff they used for common oil lamps. They had a synagogue there that was probably similar to the synagogue that was there in the time of Christ. All the synagogues, this one has a lot of similarity to the one they found at Magdala that was definitely from the time of Christ. And this is kind of the inside of it, where we get together in church and everybody looks at the guy in the front. Synagogues, you all sit in a circle, and one man will preside, the president of the synagogue, and he will ask different people to come up and read the assigned Bible quotes for the day. And each week they would read a different section of the Torah and also sections of the prophets and the other things. And so this is where the area where there was a synagogue like this in the time of Christ, where the Nazarenes there asked him to stand up and read, and he read this. This looks like what the crowd would have been like in a synagogue. And he read this. In Luke 18 and 19 says, "The Spirit of the Lord's on me because he's anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. And he sent me to heal the brokenhearted and preach deliverance to the captives and the recovering of sight to the blind, and to set at liberty them that are bruised, and to preach the acceptable year of the Lord." And then he sat down and he said, "This day is this scripture fulfilled in your ears." One thing he left out. He was quoting Isaiah 61, 1 and 2, and he read the thing, and after he read, "Proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord," he sat down. But if he'd read the second half of the verse, "It's the day of vengeance of our God to comfort all that mourn." That is a picture, folks, of the first and second coming. That's the reason he stopped in the middle of it. He was declaring that he was Christ and that he was here in the first coming. And so that to the people in that synagogue, the men in the synagogue said, "You're declaring yourself to be God." And so they they drug him out of the synagogue and took him to a cliff somewhere around Nazareth. And this is the traditional site. It's called Mount Precipice. And this is coming up the mountain from somewhere down in Nazareth, coming up the hill. And on the other side of the hill is a cliff. And I went as close as I dared to it. And it was windy up there, and I reached over and clicked with my camera. And this is what he would have been thrown down to. And I've read somewhere that the traditional stoning wasn't just have a guy stand there and start throwing rocks at him, that the first thing they did would be throw him off of a high place. And if the victim died, that he was stoned to death. If he didn't, then they would throw stones on him to finish him off. Okay, let's see if I can wind this up here. That's looking at the rest of the hill down there, and we leave, and let's see if I can get, as we leave that, we come to the Sea of Galilee. I can take a couple more minutes here. This was our first look at the Sea of Galilee in 2011, and that's the south end, and that's where the Jordan River leaves. And as we traveled toward Tiberias, where we stayed the night, we see all kinds of resort areas. They had people camp there and ride boat rides and sea-doos and all that kind of thing. And they came, and this is a statue of Yom Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee. It's harp-shaped. You can see the top has the Jordan River coming in and the Jordan River leaving. And that's a picture of Tiberias as we go into town, and from our side where we were in 2018, looking back across the river at Tiberias from Ein Gev, where we stayed in this kibbutz. And as we were coming in 2011, I was just shooting pictures out the window, and later I realized I'd found this thing. And these people value trees so much that they were willing to build a porch right around the trees. As we get to our motel at Tiberias, they told us, first night you're there, no matter how, you're going to wake up in the middle of the night. You're going to have jet lag, no matter how much you feel like getting up, lay there and rest, because we got to get over the jet lag of coming to town and all the way across the ocean and the time changes. Well, just before dawn, I thought, I'm not going to get here that often. I'm going to get up and watch the sun come up. So I went across a walkway across a street there into a park that was right next to it, and this is pre-dawn, and I met Monique there. And Monique and I watched the sun come up. And as we watched the sun come up over the Sea of Galilee in the first night we spent in Israel, one thing I might mention here, the water was much higher in those days. At Ein Gev today, this is how much it's receded. It's really low. They've had about 3 years of drought. And so they're worried that they may have to pump seawater, desalt it, and pump it into the Sea of Galilee to keep it going. Anyway, as we're looking out for the sunrise on that first morning, I noticed this in the clouds, and I'm sure that wasn't jet streams. I think it was cirrus clouds. So Monique and I got to watch sunrise and see a cross in the clouds on the first day of our trip to Israel in 2011. And with that, I'll close for the evening and thank you for time. And if I can answer any questions, I'm more than happy to. If anybody has anything.
Yeah, if you have any questions, I think it's fitting that you got us all the way to the Sea of Galilee, because next week Rami will be here, and that's where he lives. He lives on the Sea of Galilee, and we've been to his home, many of us, and Greg and I had a chance to stay there again just a few months ago, so he'll be able to tell you. They have had quite a bit of snow, like we have, and so that's good news for Israel, because as you can see, the Sea of Galilee is pretty dry, so that's going to be good in the mountains. So yeah, any questions? And if you have them, I'll word them so we can get them recorded, and then Dave can answer. You went to a lot of different cities tonight. Caesarea, good job. Tel Megiddo, where else were we? Nazareth, all the way to the Sea of Galilee, started in Tel Aviv to Joppa. Any questions? Any memories from our travelers, fellow travelers, that as you were looking at the pictures, anything just strike you? Was that a hand, Sue? No? An arm stretch. Any questions, any memories that you'd like to share? Yeah, Bob.
This is probably a really obscure question, Dave, but I noticed on the one slide where you had the Canaanite altar,
Uh-huh.
you mentioned that they had found bones on there, and what popped in my mind is, was that human bones, or was it animal bones, or do you know?
The question is, were there bones that was found on the Canaanite altar? Was that a human bones at Megiddo? I think they told us, but I don't remember exactly. So I hesitated to say they were human bones, but there were definitely human sacrifices in those days by those people. They would burn their children to get better crops and that kind of things. And they were a lusty bunch, and that was all part of their worship. And I've heard it said even their babies that were a product of that were used for sacrifice. Yeah.
Dave,
Yeah.
Did you taste the hyssop?
I did not. I didn't taste the hyssop.
I thought you might.
You can buy it all over, yeah. It was for sale in Nazareth Village's little shop there, but actually I loaded that picture of za'atar off of the internet. Now what they sell for that spice, they use it on pita bread and a lot of cooking in the Middle East, in the Middle Eastern diet, but a lot of what they sell as za'atar today is a mixture of other things, marjorie, thyme, and those kind of things. And even with the hyssop in it, it has like sesame seeds and different things mixed with it. But I didn't taste it. Well, I'm sure I have, but I didn't know it. What's that bread they sell that has cheese and herbs on it? I used to buy it at Price Chopper. Pardon? Yeah, I think Asiaga, something like that. Yeah, I think that's hyssop, or a za'atar spice on it, whether it's got hyssop in it or not.
Funny story about that hyssop when we were in the village of Nazareth, which really is a wonderful place. We didn't get to go there the first time, but we went there this time. And anytime you see Dave stopping to take a picture, we all stop to take a picture. And so, we're trekking along there in this little recreation of Nazareth. And, of course, I'm getting pictures of the sheep and the lambs and all the animals, and those two making. What'd you make? You made the... It was like a wood drill. A wood drill, and you did the wool. the spinning. We had fun with that. But he's getting a picture of that hyssop just close up, and so then I get a picture of the hyssop. And then a few more days later, when we were at the Dead Sea, is that where you left your camera?
Yeah, yeah.
And so we're calling back to the hotel, trying to retrieve the camera, hopefully, which we weren't successful at. But the first thing Dave says, I had the picture of the hyssop. I said, no worries. I also got it. I got a picture of the hyssop. But I wouldn't have gotten it if you hadn't stopped,
Well,
because
yeah.
nobody had pointed out the hyssop.
Well, I looked for it for years, and I thought I'd seen it before, but I didn't know until they
Yeah.
pointed it out. One thing I might mention, with a minute here left, the sheep in that thing weren't the same as what native sheep were in the Middle East, but I spent quite a bit of time. I used to raise sheep, so I really got into it, and like Christ being born in a manger and the sheepfolds and all those kind of things. So the native sheep in the Middle East is called the fat-tail sheep, and one of the main breeds is called a Wasi. And the reason they're fat-tailed, they don't dock their tails; they let their tails grow long. And these different breeds will store fat in their tails or in their kind of hindquarters around their tails. And just like a bear stores up fat for the winter to hibernate in North America, the Middle Eastern sheep will store up fat in their tails to make it through the drought times of the year. So in the Middle East, you have what is called the former and latter rains. So in the fall, there is a former rain that begins to water the ground for crops to come the next spring, and then the latter, and that's what pretty much waters the barley when it comes up at Passover. Then the latter rains come in early spring, right about Passover or so, to water the wheat and the rest of the crops later in the year. It's lush until about June or so, and then it turns off just like our summers do, real nasty and dried up, more so even though there. And so the sheep will breed right before the desert times or the drought times and gestate through the fall, and a lot of them anyway. They can have any lambs any time of the year, but typical lambing for these Awasis, they said, and this was a UN website I got this from, but would be around November, December. So that kind of, sparks things to me about when Christ was birthed and all those things, and the stories of the shepherds watching their flocks by night and all that. But anyway, the Awasi sheep then would have lambs if they had them in December, the lambs would be ready for market right at Passover. And they say at Passover, usually 10 people would be a group that would eat one lamb at Passover. If you didn't have enough people in your family, you invite the neighbors to try and eat up the whole carcass. Well, even then, if it were like our lambs today, a market lamb would probably produce 20 pounds or more of deboned meat. And so if you had 10 pounds or 10 people show up for a Passover, you'd have people eating 2 pounds of meat at the night of Passover and burning the rest. They had the provision, they didn't have to eat it all. But anyway, I thought that was interesting, and that kind of was stuff that pertains to Nazareth Village, but I wasn't sure I'd have time to talk about it. Anybody else got anything? Yes?
What town did you grow up in Iowa?
Southeast Iowa, Albia. Yeah. You know where that's at?
Grew up in Leon.
Oh, really? So we were, 20 miles apart? Oh, no.
No, well, further than
Leon's over
that.
west.
Straight south of Des Moines, about 60 miles south of Des Moines.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah, but it's close.
Any other questions before we wrap up? Okay. I see Greg is back. Do you want to say anything? Just pray. Okay. All right. Well, again, David, thank you so much. And let's show our appreciation. Fantastic.
Okay. I want to thank you guys, and I want to thank God for the opportunity to share these things. And the amazing thing is that He designed all this stuff and built it for exactly a purpose. It wasn't just like He was looking around to see a place for Christ to come to, he built it specifically. And so the land is a gospel in itself.
Yeah. That makes me think of one of Greg's things. I don't want to steal your thunder, but when we go to this one shop in Jerusalem, they gave you, did they not, this year, a picture, an aerial shot of the land of Israel. And carved within the land is actually the name of God. It's very interesting. You have to look carefully, of course, Hebrew. But yeah, to your point, it's not just random that God said, oh, I pick Israel. Bonk. You know, it's his land. And Greg has some neat pictures of that many who are much smarter than we are have found that to be true. So lots of wonderful things to learn. Hope you've enjoyed tonight. Again, next week, Rami will be here to teach, and then we'll continue on. Any of you who want to bring pictures, some of you have asked, can we bring our pictures from our trip? Because sometimes you need confirmation of, was this Capernaum? Was this Nazareth? Was this, you're wondering, and maybe some of us can help with that. So feel free to do that next week if you'd like to. And again, we're just so glad that you're here. So why don't you stand with me, and we'll pray, and be safe. Look out for the storm that's coming tomorrow. Friday, I think. Friday, be careful out there. And let's just, again, thank God for this opportunity. I'll pray for us again. Father, again, we thank you for tonight and just the way that we can learn from one another. I thank you for Dave and for his insights and just for the many things that he knows about your land and about your people. And I just pray, Lord, that as we leave this place, you'll go with us, keep us safe, and to the places that we go tomorrow, help us to be light, help us to make a difference in our workplaces, in our schools, in our neighborhoods, in our families, and just be who you ask us to be. And we thank you so much for Jesus and for the opportunity to be here tonight. We pray all these things in his name. And everybody said,
Amen. Next time there'll be a lot more archaeology in the trip.